The format this evening will be, I will introduce Professor Rothman. He will speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we will welcome your questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point during the talk, and we will get to them at the end of his presentation. Okay, I'll go ahead with the introduction. Joshua D. Rothman is the Secretary of the Montpelier Foundation Board of Directors and Professor and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Alabama. He was also formerly the Director of the Francis S. Summersell Center for the Study of the South. He co-directs a research project with colleagues at Cornell, the University of New Orleans, and other universities titled Freedom on the Move, a database of fugitives from North American slavery. Dr. Rothman has published 3 award-winning books: A History of Interracial Sex in Virginia Before the Civil War, titled Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia, 1787 to 1861. Flush Times and Fever Dreams, a story of capitalism and slavery in the age of Jackson. And closer to his topic this evening, his most recent book, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. Dr. Rothman has received numerous prestigious fellowships, grants, and awards for his research. His scholarship has been funded by grants from the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Virginia Historical Society, and Virginia Humanities, among others. He's also served as a consultant for numerous museums and historic sites, including the Freedom House Museum in Alexandria and the Forks of the Road site in Natchez, Mississippi. He's currently editing and writing an introduction for a new critical edition of an 1825 biography of early anti-slavery activist Elisha Tyson, and working on a history of the Ku Klux Klan hearings of 1871. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Joshua Rothman.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody for logging on tonight. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slideshow. And I apologize if it looks like I'm not looking directly at you, but the camera is up there. And so even when I look at the screen, it looks like I'm looking down. All right. So as many of you know, I did recently publish a book on the history of the domestic slave trade in the United States. Centered on the lives and the careers of 3 of the most significant slave traders in American history. And those men will make an appearance in the presentation tonight, but ultimately what I want to get at is a broader story than that. Among the surprising things I found when I was working on my book was that I would come across people, not infrequently, who did not seem to know that a domestic slave trade existed at all. Their frame of reference for slave trading was almost entirely that of the transatlantic trade from Africa. And while they immediately grasped the reality that enslaved people were bought and sold within the boundaries of the United States, once I explained it, they also would tell me that they never really thought much about it. They never learned much about it before. And I guess in a way that shouldn't have surprised me, given the enormous gaps that we know exist in K through 12 history classrooms and in the general historical understandings of many Americans when it comes to the history of slavery in the United States. But still, there was something sort of stunning about it because the sheer size of the domestic slave trade was so enormous. In fact, the domestic slave trade actually dwarfed the size of the transatlantic trade to the United States. So just to give you some numbers for some perspective here, between the early 17th century and the institution of the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, roughly 400 to 500,000 enslaved people were brought from Africa to mainland North American colonies and to the early United States. By contrast, from the 1790s until the time chattel slavery ended in 1865, roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved across state lines in the United States. About 2/3 of them were bought and sold as part of the domestic slave trade. Close to another million people, meanwhile, were bought and sold within the boundaries of individual states. In short, roughly 3 times as many enslaved people were trafficked in America's domestic slave trade over the course of about 75 years, as were trafficked in America's transatlantic trade over the course of nearly 200 years. And so the significance of the domestic trade for American slavery, for the American economy, and of course for the lives of enslaved Americans was similarly outsized. So one of the things I want to try to get across tonight is a sense of the scope and the scale and the impact of the domestic slave trade. But I also want to try to convey an understanding of the reality that the domestic slave trade itself had a history. It had a life cycle. Now, obviously, anyone who's familiar with the trade knows that it is a thing of the past. It is historical. But even as we grasp the trade as a historical phenomenon, we don't usually consider the reality that the trade was not static. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't steady over time. It had a birth and a death. It ebbed and flowed and moved. Its rhythms and its size fluctuated over the course of many decades in conjunction with the economic, political, and physical landscape of the United States. In other words, the slide that you're looking at on the screen right now, for example, it's not inaccurate. It's a roughly accurate sense of the domestic slave trade, but it's only an overview. In many ways, what the slide misses is sort of the dynamism of the story that it purports to tell. So that's another element that I want to try to get across tonight. And to tell that story, we may as well begin at the beginning. So the trade in enslaved people in the United States was as old as the United States itself. Indeed, it predated the United States itself. Africans and their descendants were bought and sold in mainland North America from the moment they were first imported to Virginia in the early 17th century. Tens of thousands of people were taken into a domestic slave trade in the colonial era and in the first decade or two of the new republic. But to the extent that we're able to track it, it seems that the internal slave trade in this period was limited, at least relative to what it would later become. And there were reasons for that. Through and after the era of the American Revolution, for example, slaveholders in places like South Carolina and Georgia continued to meet many of their labor demands by importing enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean. White migrants to new Western territories and new states, places like Kentucky and Tennessee, they tended to bring enslaved laborers with them when they moved. And the American banking system in this era was immature. It's very undercapitalized. And what that meant in turn was that there's an insufficient volume of cash to make a thriving slave trade function. But still, some of the trends that would become even more salient over time, they're there from the very beginning. They're there even in the early years of the United States. So in the 1790s, for example, more than 20,000 enslaved people were taken to other states from both Maryland and Virginia. And those Chesapeake states, and Virginia in particular, would continue to be among the largest exporters of enslaved people well into the 19th century. What's happening there is there's a stagnant and then declining tobacco economy that leaves slaveholders in those states with so-called surplus laborers, who then they put on the market for sale. And as you might imagine, the chief states and regions into which enslaved people were trafficked in this period were those where slavery was expanding the fastest, particularly Tennessee and Kentucky, and the western portions of South Carolina and Georgia. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Georgia in particular became such a hotbed of the domestic slave trade that long-distance slave traders became known colloquially among the enslaved as Georgia men. And yet, even as there was a noticeably growing number of working slave traders in the United States, the slave trade itself in this period remained sort of haphazard. Large professional slave trading businesses were almost unheard of in the 1790s, early 1800s. Slave traders in the early 19th century instead tended to be itinerants. They often worked alone or maybe with one partner. They operated out of bars, hotels, taverns. People heard about them by word of mouth, or if the place that traders were in had a newspaper, they might place an advertisement announcing that they wanted to purchase as many as several dozen enslaved people at a time. Traders then left town when they had who they wanted, and they might reappear again months later, or not. The truth was, you might never see them again. They mostly moved people by forced march over land, chained into caravans like the one on the slide here, known as coffles. Sometimes they moved people by flatboat down a river. And when traders got to markets where they intended to make sales, they similarly found temporary locations, places where buyers could find them, places where they could stash the people they'd brought with them for sale. Then they sold whoever they could, ideally for cash, and then they left. Now, obviously, none of the disorganization of this sort of fly-by-night business, none of that make the slave trade any less terrifying for enslaved people who were caught up in it. But the truth was that matters became dramatically worse as the 1800s progressed, as the slave trade became more systematic. Now, to a certain extent, again, the conditions for those changes were there in the earliest years of the 19th century. I mean, arguably the central reason for the expansion of slavery into Western Georgia and South Carolina, for example, was the emergence of short staple cotton as a cash crop. That attracted growing numbers of white farmers with desires to expand their slave labor force. And those desires for expansion were so intense that only an ongoing trade in enslaved people could satisfy them. And by the end of the first decade of the 1800s, the only legal option left for that trade was domestic. In fact, if anything, the outlawing of slave imports from outside the United States actually accelerates the growth of the domestic slave trade. Because even as the federal government banned the importation of enslaved people from abroad, it did nothing to limit domestic traffic in enslaved people. And so what happens with the ban is that the ban on one kind of slave trading simultaneously creates a federally sanctioned and federally protected market for a different one. And the roles of the federal government on the one hand and the cotton economy on the other, their roles in boosting the domestic slave trade start to converge even more dramatically in the 1810s and the 1820s. Now, white American settlements were already moving toward and up and down the Mississippi River by the 1810s. Populations were growing in places like Louisiana and the Mississippi territories in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase. But military and diplomatic victories over both the British and numerous Indian nations during the War of 1812, those things provided security and market access for white farmers in the Lower South who saw economic possibilities, not only in cotton, but also in a burgeoning sugar industry. And to capitalize on that, they wanted slave labor. And slave traders angled to provide it. The number of enslaved people moved across state lines grew by 80% from the 1800s to the 1810s. It grew by another 25% from the 1810s to the 1820s. And all told, in the first 30 years of the 19th century, nearly 350,000 enslaved people suffered forced migration in what historian Ira Berlin famously referred to as a second Middle Passage. Roughly 80% of those people, more than 275,000 in total, were taken out of Maryland and Virginia. But the geography of the slave trade was shifting noticeably on the demand side as slavery's gravity slowly but steadily moved farther south and farther west. So by the 1820s, the enslaved population of states like Georgia and Tennessee were still growing thanks to the domestic slave trade. But South Carolina and even Kentucky had become net exporters of enslaved people. Places like West Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri, those places were seeing the activities of slave traders increase instead. River cities of the lower South, places like New Orleans and Natchez, this is the era when those places become leading markets for slaveholders and for slave traders alike. And yet there is unfortunately more. For all that the domestic trade boomed in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, it's arguably the 1830s that saw the slave trade's most stunning transformations. And in part, that was because of how growing numbers of slave traders themselves changed the methods of their operations. And the men at the center of my book, Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, they're the industry leaders in these kinds of changes. So through their company, known as Franklin and Armfield, the three created a slave trading firm beginning in the late 1820s that was an ongoing partnership, regular places of business, headquarters that served as offices and slave pens all in one. From their bases of operation in Alexandria and Richmond in the Upper South, Franklin and Armfield ran newspaper advertisements throughout the Chesapeake that ran every day, all year long. They let customers know that the company would buy large numbers of enslaved people, and they would pay higher cash prices for those people than any other slave trader in the market. The company had a small army of purchasing agents and sub-agents, people who were ultimately able to cover more than 20,000 square miles of Maryland and Virginia. And they spread out and spread the company's money to purchase enslaved people. And while the company sometimes marched people overland, long distance in coffles, they mostly trafficked people by ship, down the Atlantic coast, around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, and up the mouth of the Mississippi River to New Orleans. They might be sold to cotton and sugar planters and to merchants and other buyers right there in that city. Or sometimes, after being transferred from a sailing ship to a steamboat, they were sent farther upriver for sale in Natchez. And regardless of whether Franklin and Armfield moved people over land or whether they moved them by ship, the company dealt in enormous volumes, typically moving between 100 and 200 people at a time. And at the peak of their operations, they're doing that roughly every 2 weeks. So this is a very new kind of slave trading business. This is a business that is organized and steady. It's efficient and reliable for customers. It's absolutely unrelenting when it comes to the enslaved captives who were treated as merchandise. It's also a business that is integrating enslaved people with money market and credit flows. Again, small-time slave traders made sales almost entirely in cash. They have very short-term interests. They have no desire to have to return to customers months or even years after a sale to collect debts from a credit sale. Franklin and Armfield, though, are different. They understood that the volume in which the company dealt, the stature that it had in the industry, the intention that the partners had to run an ongoing concern, all of those things gave them access to borrowed capital. And they knew that if they borrowed money at one end, they could extend credit at the other end, and all of it would pay off over the long haul much more handsomely than quick cash sales. And they knew that there were a lot of potential purchasers of enslaved people who might either be short on cash or who preferred to borrow against the future rather than pay for slaves up front. So the company established credit lines with banks in New Orleans, banks in New York, banks in Philadelphia. And by establishing credit lines, what they could do was sell enslaved people in the lower South for commercial paper. They could then transmit that paper to the upper South, where it would be run through a series of banking networks there and turned back into cash. And then the cash gets pumped back into the purchasing markets. And fairly quickly, there are dozens of slave trade partnerships and companies that patterned themselves on the Franklin and Armfield model. And they're able to do it for many of the same reasons that the partners in Franklin and Armfield were able to do what they did. And that's basically because the first 5 or 6 years of the 1830s saw the biggest economic boom the United States had ever seen to that point in its history. And the heart of that boom lay in the land, slave, and cotton economies of the Lower South. So the white population of the Lower South had already increased by roughly 700,000 people in the 1820s. It would increase by nearly 1 million more in the 1830s. And again, the federal government's actively involved here. It's encouraged by federal policies that force native nations off the best cotton land on the continent. It's encouraged by a rapidly proliferating system of banks and an expansion of banking capital that floods the Lower South with banknotes and easy credit and cheap loans. And it's helped by cotton prices that nearly doubled between 1830 and 1835 alone. When you mixed all of that together, what you had was a demand for slaves that skyrockets. In the 1830s, slave traders moved about as many people via the interstate trade as they had during the 1810s and 1820s put together. The number of enslaved people trafficked in the trade jumped by 85% from the 1820s to the 1830s. In Louisiana and Mississippi, where Franklin and Armfield did most of their business, the net increase in enslaved people trafficked into the state from one decade to the next was 78% in Louisiana and 420% in Mississippi. But there was plenty of business to go around. Alabama saw an increase of nearly 80%, Missouri an increase of 140%, Arkansas an increase of around 500%, and the states of Maryland and Virginia alone, meanwhile, saw more than 150,000 enslaved people forcibly removed over that same period of time. By the middle of the 1830s, the slave trade was everywhere in the slave states, and its economic impact was felt well beyond that. Travelers reported seeing slave coffles on nearly every southern road. Slave sales were held on docks of port and river cities and on the steps of every county courthouse. Enslaved people taken up as runaways might be sold by local jailers. People unfortunate enough to be enslaved by a person who died in debt might be sold at the sale of his estate. Hotels and taverns often doubled as sites of public slave auctions. And slave traders in cities and towns throughout the region advertised their merchandise. They lined people up in the street. They enticed customers into their slave pens. They hung red flags outside of their establishments that everyone understood meant that people would be sold inside that day. Now, obviously, none of this explosion of the slave trade happens without consequences. It occurred simultaneous to the rise of the abolitionist movement, for example, and anti-slavery activists made the slave trade a particular focus of their assault on slavery. Now, most slave sales in the United States did not actually happen with people being sold at auction on the block. But abolitionists drew attention to the hideous shamefulness of the auction that made Black misery and exploitation into public spectacle. And more generally, they pointed to the slave trade as exemplary of slavery's evils and its ability to corrupt everything from Black families to the work ethic and character of white Southerners to the economic system of the entire country. Now, of course, the most profound and the most devastating consequences of the slave trade were felt by enslaved people themselves. Being trafficked in the slave trade meant a punishing trip in shackles or below decks of a ship. And not everyone survived. It meant being left vulnerable to epidemic disease and to the violence and potential sexual assault of slave traders and purchasers. Moreover, every person bought and sold in the domestic slave trade marked a family torn apart, a parent or a child or a spouse separated from their loved ones, a hole left in the fabric of a community. By the second quarter of the 19th century, more than 1 in 3 first marriages among enslaved people was destroyed by the slave trade. And an enslaved person in the Upper South faced a more than 1 in 3 chance of being sold before they reached their mid-20s. Thousands of people were sold more than once. Their lives are left subject to the whims of their enslavers and the economy alike, as they're passed from place to place over the course of years. And enslaved people fought the slave trade with every fiber of their being. They begged, they bargained to avoid their own sales or those of their loved ones. They fled enslavement, sometimes in advance of a sale they knew was coming, and sometimes soon after they had been trafficked into a world of strangers. They fought and sometimes killed slave traders in efforts to escape, and they rose in rebellion on ships bringing them to the Lower South. But for most, escape and rebellion were not feasible options. The only real option was finding a way to survive. And ultimately, the growth of the slave trade in the 1830s, it even hurt the people who believed that they benefited from it. The boom economy of the 1830s was a debt-fueled bubble economy. And the slave trade in particular, and the over-leveraged investments slaveholders had in enslaved people generally, those things played outsized roles in inflating the bubble. And when the bubble burst in the spring of 1837, it took the slave trade business with it. It ravaged the slave trade business just as it did most forms of commerce that depended on the currents of credit flowing around the world. Now, enslaved people suffered no matter what the economic circumstances of white people were. And in the wake of the Panic of 1837, the characteristic slave sale of the era went from being an auction block or a slave trader's showroom to a sheriff's sale. Thousands of enslaved people get sold to stave off bankruptcies during the Depression. But the slave trade business itself actually went into a fairly steep decline in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Which is not to say that slaveholders and slave traders actually learned anything from the disaster that was the Panic of 1837. Instead, by the middle of the 1840s, as the nation recovered from its economic debacle, the slave trade took off again. Now, it never quite took the same explosive shape that it had in the first half of the 1830s, but a new raging demand for enslaved people came into being nonetheless. And it continued to demonstrate the imperative by slaveholders to stay on the move, because the environmental impact of their agricultural practices led them constantly into new territories to exploit. So they started bringing previously undeveloped regions of Louisiana and Mississippi into cultivation, which kept the demand for the slave trade vibrant in those states. But by the 1850s, enslaved people could see the signs of slavery's shifting frontiers in the trends of where they were being bought and sold. Momentum by the 1850s had slowed down a bit, even in Louisiana and Mississippi. People were generally now being sold away from Georgia, from Tennessee, from northern Alabama, places where the slave trade had been thriving for decades. Increasingly, the hottest markets for the slave trade were instead in new states, new slaving regimes, in places like Arkansas and Florida, and especially in Texas. And as slavery and the slave trade found fresh momentum, slave traders and slave holders alike became arguably even more bullish about slavery's future than they had ever been before. Leading Southerners began entertaining dreams of extending American sovereignty to places like Cuba and Central America. Slave prices, which typically rose and fell alongside the price of cotton, in the 1850s, they started becoming delinked from cotton prices. They simply shot upward instead. And as more and more slave traders jumped to capitalize on this seemingly boundless, yet seemingly irrational demand, more and more of them built large firms that were structurally like the one pioneered by Franklin and Armfield. The number of enslaved people forced across state lines jumped again. Where it had dropped by about 35% from the 1830s to the 1840s, it grew by nearly a third from the 1840s to the 1850s. Roughly 250,000 people were trafficked between states in the 1850s, culminating America's experience with the domestic slave trade with a forced migration that was almost as large as it had been in the 1830s. Slavery and the slave trade were not slowing down when the Civil War came in 1861. On the contrary, they were growing almost as fast as they had ever grown before. And their agents were adopting the most modern technologies to make the system more functional, more efficient. Now, they'd always done that, right? Capitalizing on things like the cotton gin and the steamboat to grow and extend their reach. And in the 1850s, the new technologies they used to take advantage of were things like the railroad and the telegraph. Slave traders began sending people by rail and penetrating interior markets that had once been relatively isolated. They began sharing information about prices and market conditions via telegraph, learning about circumstances on the ground hundreds of miles away in moments, rather than in the weeks that letters had taken to go back and forth. By the outbreak of the Civil War, American investments in enslaved people were staggering in their size. They had between $3 and $4 billion invested in the bodies of the enslaved. That was more money than Americans at the time had invested in banks and railroads and manufacturing put together. Outside of real estate, enslaved people were the largest asset class in the entire country. And the value of that asset class would then be wiped out by the war that brought about the demolition of slavery and the slave trade. And an early sign of that demolition came in May 1861 in Alexandria, where Union forces liberated the slave pen that had once been John Armfield's headquarters. But it would still be several years before the domestic slave trade ended for good. White Southerners held on to slavery to the very, very end. Slave traders offered their wares to the very end. There's a market in enslaved people carried on inside the Confederacy, even as slavery itself collapsed, even as Confederate currency inflated to the point where it was practically useless. When the Union finally liberated Richmond in April 1865, they had to track down a slave trader who had chained the people still in his jail together and was trying to march them out of town in the hopes of selling them somewhere else. Even in his death throes, he figured the slave trade would still find a market somewhere. Now, there's a final note to this story that I think it's important to recognize, which is that as the domestic slave trade itself came to its miserable conclusion, some of the truths about it became wiped from the memories of many Americans, particularly from the memories of white Americans. And it happened purposefully, as white Southerners rewrote the history that had led the nation to the Civil War, and white Northerners too often chose to believe the mythology rather than carry on an ideological struggle that had been going on in the country for decades. White Southerners told lies about the slave trade from the very moment abolitionists started critiquing it. They agreed that the slave trade was indeed a terrible thing, but they claimed that slaveholders only engaged in it rarely. They said that they never wanted to break apart slave families, that they found the slave trade distasteful, and that slave traders were miserable outcasts who took advantage of slaveholder financial difficulties, who were responsible for slavery's worst outrages, and who were individuals with whom no respectable person had dealings outside of business affairs. Now, this constellation of ideas, which is developed while slavery still exists, it carried over into the post-war era. It became central to the mythology of the lost cause. And like nearly everything else about the lost cause, it was self-serving nonsense. Millions of slave sales testified to the reality that they were not rare. The narratives of enslaved people tell us that slaveholders made sales not only when their finances left them with no choice, but also as a form of punishment because they saw it as economically prudent, or simply because they felt like it. Slave traders who became extravagantly wealthy, who associated with and married into families of planters and lawyers and other members of the so-called respectable classes, and did it without difficulty. Those experiences testified to the reality that the profession of slave trading did not by any stretch of the imagination make a person an outcast. And of course, enslaved people themselves could testify to the reality that family separations were commonplace. They spent years, sometimes decades, after slavery had ended, looking for loved ones who had been taken from them by the slave trade, placing their own ads in the newspapers that might be read as being in dialogue with the ads of the traders who stole their children and their spouses and their parents. But where slave traders almost always took their profits, the formerly enslaved very rarely saw their reunion. And I think quite literally the least that we could do is tell the truth about that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a lot of questions. I'm happy to take them for as long as people are willing to stick around. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Josh. That is incredibly disturbing and hard to get your head around. I have a question related to Montpelier. We know that Madison, that in 1834, Madison sold 16 enslaved people to a cousin who was moving to Louisiana, and they ended up in Point Coupee Parish, which is northwest of Baton Rouge. And I've always thought of it as, you know, a couple chained together of people who would have to walk.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any patterns? Can you kind of sketch out how what the voyage might, or the trip would have been?
If they're walking,
or would they most likely have gone by boat from Virginia to?
it really depends. There's no necessary way. People walking was much more common because it is less expensive for slave traders who don't have a lot of money. There's sort of a, you know, they have to think about, all right, do you want to spend more money and get people there faster, and in a way that is probably safer? It's much more dangerous to walk because it's just, I mean, you can't eat. It's unimaginably exhausting. Or if they were willing to save money, and there are timing issues involved. Also, because most people in the slave trade are moved within individual states, that tended to be a coffle system. So people are walking, you know, maybe 50 or 100 miles, which is no small thing, but it doesn't, you know, it pales compared to what would be, you know, 1,100 miles to someplace like Natchez or New Orleans. But if people are going to walk and they're leaving Central Virginia, they're going to make their way west to the Shenandoah Valley. Winchester was a sort of common junction for slave traders. They'd sort of head up out of Alexandria to Winchester, and then they'd head south through the valley. But however you got there, you would generally head down the valley, roughly parallel with where I-81 is now. You go south and west through Virginia and to Tennessee, and then you'd probably pick up the Natchez Trace, or some other road. There are other roads that go through as time goes on. Sometimes people would walk over to the Mississippi and then transfer to a boat, depending where they're going. But that's generally how the path would work its way over through Tennessee, down through Mississippi, and then out into Louisiana. But often it'll be sort of halfway walking, halfway by flatboat. None of these paths are pleasant or easy. They're horrific. I don't even understand how people did it, but they did. They walk, you know, they're walking, you know, without anything like a modern shoe, sometimes without shoes at all. 15 miles a day, carrying 20 pounds of shackles. I don't understand how it's done, but that's how it worked.
So we do have a few questions from the audience. Mark says, what was your biggest surprise within all the data you've collected?
That's an interesting question. Because, you know, this is not my first book on slavery, and I sort of knew, I had a feeling what I was in for, right? I think in some ways what surprised me the most, and maybe it shouldn't, none of this probably should have surprised me, was some of it was sort of my own, sort of how the information sat with me personally. I found it a lot harder to live with as a subject than I thought I would, which is probably, you know, most people would imagine like, well, what did you think was going to happen? But like I said, I've worked on slavery for a long time, and you find ways of sort of grappling with the material, even no matter how difficult and horrendous it is. The slave trade was another level for me, and it surprised me how difficult it was. I think honestly, what surprised me probably the most from, and this isn't a data question, this is a sort of experiential issue. is, getting back to description of how a coffle worked, is that, people do ask me sometimes, well, did people die? Right? Because we're used to associating the transatlantic slave trade and the passage of the middle, the experience of the Middle Passage, where we know, anywhere from 10 to 30% of people could die on a voyage. I think what maybe surprised me in some ways is that most people survived. And it's not just the physical experience of it, right? It's the being separated from your children, your parents, with almost always without warning, almost always without any ability to ever see or hear from them again. I don't think I would survive. I don't think most of us would survive. I'm not sure most of us would want to survive, but people did. And that it speaks to a level of determination and perseverance that is absolutely astonishing. People who are thrust into they're tossed into their nightmares. And there's really in a country that says it's okay, right? I mean, all of this is legal. And they survived because they felt like they had to. And that to me is, I don't know if it's surprising is the right word, but it never ceases to astonish me.
A question from Bertha. Is there truth about when enslaved people were expedited by boat that the slaveholders were required to provide more biographical details? I'm thinking specifically about slaves sent down to Florida in St. Mark's.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question about the records. People who are marched over land, the records are very sparse. You have to get lucky to find them in slave trader accounts. But people who are sent by boat, so part of the law that bans the domestic slave, the transatlantic slave trade, it puts in place bureaucracy for shipping people domestically. And effectively what it does is it requires shippers to provide a manifest that has a list of the people who are being sent. And they have to swear to that manifest that none of those people were brought into the country after 1808, right? You have to document that you are not violating the law. You have to go through customs, both at the shipment end and at the receiving end. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of ship manifests that have survived. And every ship manifest will have on it the names of the individual enslaved people. It has their ages. It has their assigned sex. It has their skin color as determined by the white people who are recording it, and it has their height. And so if you are fortunate enough to find a manifest of, for example, an ancestor, there is much more biographical information about who ships them, when they are shipped, where they are shipped from, and where they are shipped to in the manifests than there are for people who are sent over land. So yes, that is absolutely true. Whether you can find, not every manifest has survived. So there's no way to make it comprehensive, but there are a lot of them. Many of them are on Ancestry, but not all of them. So they pop up in weird places. I found one in the library at UVA. I had one somebody sent me from a library in England. One somebody sent me from a library in Minnesota. So they're kind of little scattered all over the place, but the core of them are digitized and they're on Ancestry.
Next question from Laura. Were there any scruples, at least in lip service, when it came to selling babies and or children away from parents? Or was it just a tacit agreement that anyone was eligible for sale?
So slave traders themselves don't really care. Slave traders themselves are interested in profit. And if somebody could be sold for profit, it makes no difference to them how old they are. However, there is some lip service given to the idea that young children should not be sold away from their mothers. So you can see in slave trader records that young women are often sold together with children who are, infants and toddlers. The state of Louisiana passes a law at a certain point, I think in the late 1820s, maybe early 1830s, that says that you cannot sell a child away from a parent if they are younger than 10, right? So that tells you something about where the scruples are, right? An 11-year-old you could sell, no problem. And the reality is that it is, to a certain extent, it is lip service, right? Because slave traders could sell somebody who was a 9-year-old and say, well, they're an orphan. There's no way to demonstrate that one way or the other. So yeah, there is, I would not say that there are genuine, I think there are individual people who have genuine scruples, who the process of slave trading makes them so uncomfortable and so squeamish that they can't bring themselves, there's a point beyond which they will not go. That's generally not true of slave traders. It's generally not true in the law. And more often than not, it is lip service. Yeah.
Did the states attempt to regulate the domestic slave trade or raise taxes from it?
They tried both, actually. Not every state and not consistently. Mississippi, for example, does have a slave trade tax for a while. It's sort of sporadically enforced. People sometimes paid it, sometimes they didn't. Pretty much every state in the lower South at some point or another tries banning the slave trade. And they don't do it mostly because they have sort of moral issues with it. The problem that they see is severalfold. One is that they are concerned that slave traders are bringing them people and they don't know where they're coming from, right? So particularly in the aftermath of something like Nat Turner, there's a fear that the people who are being brought are criminals or insurrectionists or otherwise sort of dangerous to public safety, by which they meant dangerous for white people. So sometimes that's a concern. And some states, as a consequence of that, decide they pass laws that call for certificates of good character, where slave traders had to have a certificate for each enslaved person that was sworn to by their previous enslaver and by 2 witnesses and by the clerk of the court from the county that they came from, that they had never been involved in insurrection and that they were not habitual runaways. Another reason that they sometimes pass laws is that they are worried that the influx of enslaved people to a state is happening so quickly that it's throwing off the demographic of the state itself. Again, it's a fear issue. Some places it's also an economic issue. Slave traders, when they get paid, they take the capital with them. They don't stay in state. And so you have this out in a cash poor kind of system, which changes over time, right? There's much more cash to go around, but sometimes there isn't. And there's a fear that cash and capital is just flowing out of the state. There's an imbalance there. But for whatever reason that they pass these laws, they're sporadically enforced, and they don't last very long. Very few states keep them on the books for very long periods of time because slaveholders don't want them restricted. They want to be able to engage in the slave trade.
What was the rate of people dying on the coffle marches?
It's really variable. I don't know that anyone's been able to really calculate sort of a percentage. And it really depends, right? Sometimes people can go from point A to point B and everybody lives. Probably most of the time, everybody lives, particularly if it's over shorter distances. But there are plenty of stories where people die of exhaustion, people die of dehydration, of malnutrition, people are beaten to death on the road, and people get sick. If there are, in the early 1830s, there's a series of cholera outbreaks, for example. And if there's a cholera outbreak in a slave coffle or on a ship, people are going to die. So it depends. I don't know that anyone's been able to sort of calculate with any precision sort of what the sort of percentage was. I think the records aren't there for it, and it's very variable.
have descendants of slave traders contacted you regarding your book?
So they haven't contacted me, but I've contacted them sometimes. When I started researching the book, I came across a Facebook group of people who were descended from Isaac Franklin's father. So Isaac Franklin had like 9 brothers and sisters. He has no living white descendants, but his brothers and sisters do. And so I reached out to them, had no idea how that was going to go. And honestly, they could not have been more welcoming, open-minded. They sort of knew about the history and were trying to learn more about it. A lot of them didn't know it growing up. You know, parents and grandparents and great-grandparents really didn't tell them very much. And over the course of time, I got to that sort of group of people I first met sort of expanded. So I met people who were descendants of, again, John Armfield and his wife did not have any living white children. But they took in some of John Armfield's wife's nieces and nephews and sort of raised them as their own. And so they're descendants of those people who are alive. And I met some of them. It's really, it was an interesting experience for me just to sort of listen to them reflect on this history. I think it's a lot more challenging for them. They feel the weight of that legacy. They feel it as a burden and a responsibility. I don't mean a burden like an unfair burden, but it weighs on them. They want to do something about it, and they have tried doing things about it, particularly working with Freedom House in Alexandria. But I think there's still things that they would like to do, and they're sort of figuring out how to do that.
Can you give us an idea of how pregnant women made this journey? Do you see any parallels to how Black women are treated today?
So women who were pregnant, if they are part of a coffle, from what we can tell, they generally are put in a wagon. So slave traders the traders themselves rode horseback. If they could afford it, they would bring a wagon or two that would carry supplies and sometimes tents to sleep out on the road. And often pregnant women and very young children would go by wagon. Now going by wagon is no fun, right? I mean, these are wagons that are going on, country roads without suspension systems. This is not easy. We know that there are women who give birth on slave ships that are carrying them from one place to another. We can see it in the manifest where people are born en route. How they made the journey with extreme difficulty. But there aren't really there are no exceptions made. Right. I don't think there are very many cases of people who are, I mean, there are probably anecdotally cases where people say, I'm going to wait till after this person delivers a baby before I send them anywhere. But pregnancy was certainly no bar to being shipped in the slave trade. And again, the experience of that is sort of hard to imagine. Parallels to how Black women are treated today. I mean, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, I know that we know, and I'm not an expert in this, but I know what I read about health disparities. I know what I read about. We know that when Black people generally and Black women in particular report that they are in pain or they are suffering or they have something they believe is wrong with them, they are often disbelieved, or they're simply assumed that they can tolerate that better. I think that was probably true in the 19th century as well. The idea that people of African descent could bear pain and work and do all of those things in a way that white people could not. So I don't know if there's a direct connection between those experiences, but if that's what the question is driving at, it's not hard to imagine that there are some parallels there.
Slaves were expensive, thus valuable. I was recently made aware of slaves being used as collateral for loans.
Mhm.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, because enslaved people were a capital asset, they could be used in the same way that any capital asset could. And so enslaved people were bought and sold. They could be rented. They could be used as collateral to underwrite a loan. Enslaved people in some states were used to underwrite banks. And so there are things called plantation banks. And what would happen is the shareholders of that bank would pledge their land and the people they enslaved on it to underwrite the capital of the bank. And then that bank would then issue bonds based on that. When Franklin and Armfield, for example, and when other slave traders sold enslaved people on credit, enslaved people themselves are the collateral. So like what happens if somebody doesn't pay for a person on credit? Well, they get repossessed, right? So effectively what's happening is that enslaved people are sort of underwriting their own sales. So any way you can imagine that capital could be manipulated and leveraged and used to make more capital was also true of enslaved people before the Civil War.
This next question is somewhat similar. You spoke of long-term borrowing in support of long-term credit. That sounds like the classic stuff, treasury management. The word bond evokes finance, but also the essence of forced labor.
Mm.
Can you speak more about the influence of slavery on the emergence of modern finance?
So that's an interesting question, right? Because there's a clear sort of disjunction that happens when emancipation happens, right? Now, of course, there are incidents in which, you know, slaveholders are compensated. We know that there are situations in, say, the District of Columbia, for example, like that. But by and large, slaveholders are not compensated when enslaved people are emancipated. And of course, enslaved people themselves are not compensated for anything, which is sort of a separate to this discussion. But how its relationship to modern finance. So, you know, I think slavery isn't the only place where you see the precursors to things like, you know, this was something that people talked about in the aftermath of the financial crisis, right? Collateralized debt obligations and things like that, and sort of selling things in tranches. You know, plantation banks do a version of that, which is not to say that, you know, that plantation banks are the sort of, you know, the origin of that. But I think the things that, to the extent that modern finance can be traced back to the pre-Civil War era, you saw many of those precursors that could be used with slavery as well as anything else. So it's not that slavery itself is the precursor to modern finance, but that the precursors to modern finance were perfectly compatible with slavery. You know, big banks in the United Kingdom, for example, are investors in the lower South, in the cotton economy, in the plantation economy. You know, they see that as part of their portfolio of assets. And like I said before, you know, enslaved people could be turned into bonds. They could be insured. You know, accounting systems take account for the management of plantations, things like that. So all the sort of precursors that we think of as kind of modern financial systems, some of them exist before the Civil War, and when they do, they're not entirely separable from slavery.
Narratives from enslavers exist regarding their experiences as slaveholders.
So narratives are less common. At least if you're thinking of a narrative as sort of a parallel to a slave narrative, right, where somebody gets and sort of writes their experience down. But certainly there are slaveholders who kept diaries, particularly slaveholding women kept diaries where they do talk about their experience of slaveholding. They tend not to be very reflective about it, right? They don't think about what it is that they're doing, what it might mean for the people that they are enslaving. They're mostly sort of talking about their lives, and you know, sometimes there are women who find the experience of being a slaveholder something they find very, very distasteful. They don't want to do it anymore. those can be a little bit reflective, but there really isn't sort of a genre of narratives exactly, but there are diaries.
Can you also talk about the exportation of First Nations, Native, or Indigenous people to the Caribbean during the time period you researched? Did the slave traders you researched do any of that?
No, that's a phenomenon that happens mostly before the 19th century, right? We know, for example, that indigenous people who are taken captive in wars in South Carolina and in Massachusetts and in Virginia and other places are sent out of the colonies and sent to places in the Caribbean where they would be enslaved. By the time you get to the 19th century, indigenous slavery gets sort of blurrier, at least in American law. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It certainly does happen. We know that there is slavery among Native peoples as well, but slave traders, by and large, are not generally involved in shipping Native peoples outside the United States, which in any case was, that it also becomes sort of illegal, right? It effectively is in the same category as piracy. And in theory, you could be executed for it. So, the illegal slave trade is something that definitely happens, but it happens it happens pretty covertly. There are good books about it and there are records of it, but it's not something that somebody who was running an above board or a legal slave trading business would generally get involved in. They tended to be different categories of people.
Were there any successful rebellions or escapes? And I assume they mean on these journeys.
Escapes, yes. Rebellions, rarely. Rebellions on board slave ships, they happen. We know of instances like the Creole, for example, which happens in the 1840s. There are several planned rebellions that sort of break out in the 1830s that are often sort of quashed. Given the sheer number of domestic slaving trips, rebellions are relatively rare, particularly compared to the transatlantic slave trade, where rebellions were much more common. But people did run. If people in coffles, if they could run, they're going to run. And if they don't run in the coffles, which was very difficult, right? People were in chains all the time. But it's very common to see in runaway ads in newspapers references to people who because enslavers are going to basically describe the person. And they say all the time, like, I just bought this person from such and such a person. This person says he ran away from this slave trader. That happens all the time, right? People would do anything they could to try to get back to their families, if not to freedom.
What did you find out about the impact of slave importation on poor white farming?
I didn't sort of spend a lot of time sort of focusing on that. But slave trading does, over time, it constrains the possibilities for poor white people. Wealthy Southerners tried to sell the idea that slavery was sort of the guarantee of white equality and white democracy, that it provided opportunity for white people by keeping Black people enslaved. But what we see, particularly by the 1850s, is that as the prices of enslaved people go up, it becomes harder and harder and harder to become a member of the slaveholding class, right? So wealth in many parts of the South actually gets more concentrated. Slaveholding gets more concentrated over time. So I don't know that I'm trying to think off the top of my head whether anyone's done sort of systematic research on how the slave trade in particular has an impact on poorer white people. And you have to sort of qualify what you mean by poor, right? Because particularly in sort of times like the 1830s, where the economy is flush with money, pretty much anyone could get a loan. anyone can put down some money and try to buy an enslaved person, right? So in that, now, whether or not that's going to actually pay off over time is a different question. But certainly there's a widespread belief among people who are maybe not the poorest people, but are maybe in sort of the yeoman class. They believe that slavery is a path to opportunity and to rising up the economic ladder. And the slave trade is integral to that because they are providing the labor force.
What is the number one thing you would like people to take away from your research and book? And do you suggest any action on our part now that our eyes are open?
I don't like trying to tell people what they should do and what they should think, right? I do that with my students, and I wouldn't presume to do that with readers, to sort of tell them what they ought to do. I think what I would like people to take away from the book is maybe sort of get people to have an image in their head of what slavery was and how it operated that maybe is if not different than the way I think most people think of it, that is more expansive than the way most people think of it. I think most Americans imagine slavery basically as a system of farms, right? Discrete places where people work. And even people who have a richer understanding of slavery and understand that, you know, that this is coerced labor, right? That this is nothing but sort of naked exploitation, still have that image in their head that it's farms, right? But I think that if we fold the slave trade into the equation, you realize that it's not simply a series of farms. It's a system. It's an integrated economic system in which labor and cash is constantly moving in a cycle. It's connected to and an integral part of a larger national and global system that is consuming the cotton that people produce, that is making money off investments in things that are associated with the economy of slavery. What people take away from that understanding and what they do with it, I think that's going to vary a lot from person to person. And I'll say one thing that I don't think is the point. And this is something that I think a lot of people who are maybe resistant to hearing this history feel like is the point. And I think we see this in sort of some of our sort of popular and political discourse, to the extent we still have that, is that people imagine that the point is to make white people feel bad. They should feel guilty. That's not the point. That's not helpful. It's not useful. And it's not relevant, right? The point isn't you should feel guilty or you should feel responsible. The point, I think, is that all of us, I think particularly white Americans, need to recognize that we have inherited the legacy of this history. It doesn't matter whether your family showed up in 1650 or 1950, right? You are participating in a legacy of this history, and you have benefited from that. Now, that's not to say everybody benefits from it equally. It's not to say that people don't have their own sort of, their own sort of limitations of their family circumstances, of their economic circumstances, of their personal circumstances. All of those things are true. But systematically, we have inherited this past. And it doesn't mean that, I mean, there are people who would argue, well, we need something sort of radically different in order to make up for that. I don't know what we need to do to make up for that, but I do know that we're not going to get anywhere by pretending that it's over and done with, right? That there's nothing left of that anymore because it happened a long time ago. There are probably a few people alive today who, if not their parents, certainly had grandparents who were enslaved. this isn't that long ago. And I think, what do we do with that? I don't know. I would never, like I said, I wouldn't presume to tell people what to do, but I do think that if we had a more thorough sort of attempt at a more thorough sort of recognition of where that history has kind of led us and what's left from it, we would make different choices. I would say that. I know it's a little vague, but that's I guess that's what I'd say.
I think that is an excellent final question. It's 8:16. I'd like to thank you so much, Professor Rothman, for sharing this incredibly important, difficult subject with our group of Montpelier members and friends. And we look forward to hearing from you again in the future. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions. I could see in the chat that there are a lot, and I'm appreciative of your time. And if there's something I didn't get to that it's like I really wanted to ask that question, go ahead and email me, and I'd be happy to answer it.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Take care.